Well, we'll turn the time over to Peter.
All right, well, that's good. Thank you, guys. So I know that this was the best possible introduction to a seminar that you could get. You got the great news that it was canceled, and then the news that I was going to do it. So I figured I'm probably the least exciting speaker you could have leading up to it, because you're like, yes! Oh man, it doesn't even matter what it was now. Okay, so that's kind of how it works. So robots, video games, second languages, and math. What do they have in common? Any guesses here?
You're interested in all of them.
I'm interested in all of them. All right, Alita got it. All right, you're dismissed. Go. Eric.
I was going to say they all involve some kind of language, and they all involve some kind of formulas.
Okay, they all involve languages and formulas. Good, good. Hopefully you'll see why sometimes it might seem like, wow, Peter's doing some weird and disparate things. At the end of this today, you'll kind of have the vision I have, and I'll make no qualms about it. I'll get up on my soapbox today, so I'm asking you to join me on my soapbox. So if it seems scattered, that's just because that's where my brain is. If it seems organized, then wow. Go ahead.
Does music fit into that list?
Music may fit into that list, and you might have things that you could put into that list at the end as well. So yeah, I think some of my music friends have told me to stay away from that. But I would say it does. Actually, I would say a lot of things do. So it's a good question. I want to talk a little bit about trends in education. When I say back to the basics, what are the basics? Who understands what the basics are?
Reading, writing, and arithmetic.
All right, reading, writing, and arithmetic. All right, so we came up with the 3 R's that aren't really 3 R's. We'll add a 4th R to that isn't really an R today as well. But there have been trends in the basics. And did everybody know that the basics actually haven't been the basics for very long? If you look at the trends in sort of the education, at least in the United States, you have Ralph Tyler. And Rich might be able to tell you a little bit more about what happened here, but basically, in the 1940s and 1950s, they said, look, people are going out and doing all sorts of things. Right? They're teaching whatever, and they realized this a lot through the Second World War. We need to sort of standardize education across the United States. And so you had sort of a back to the basics movement that happened here. Then people started to say, well, what's taught in Idaho is comparable to what's taught in these other places. We can at least agree on something common that people can understand. Then people started getting creative and doing their own things again. And you had another report that came out in 1983, A Nation at Risk. The report itself, if you read it, doesn't say we need to go back to the basics. But the way that I look at a lot of what happened, you did have another sort of back to the basics movement. You had this again with a TIMS study. The TIMS was an international study done on teachers. One of the first really big internationally done using video on teachers all across the world. And that kind of led to the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 2001, otherwise known affectionately. Does everybody know what we affectionately refer to? Nickelby, No Child Left Behind, right? Okay, so that's really what happened. Well, around that time, and actually 2000, I believe, was really when it started, but we've got data from 2003. Every 3 years, there's the Program for International Student Assessment. The countries that are part of the OECD, the Organization for Economic, well, what's the C stand for? Cooperation and Development, thank you. The OECD countries and several of their partners that aren't part of that organization decided, you know, we really need a way to compare ourselves internationally. We need to do this. And so they started testing mathematics and literacy. They've added science to this every 3 years, 15-year-olds in countries across the world.
And the result just came out yesterday.
And actually, I was going to give you some results that just came out for 2012 results just came out yesterday. So, well, you're on top of it. Look at that. Yeah, so I was like, this is really good timing because the results just came out. It was great. So I want to look at some of the PISA data. If we look at this, the PISA data, oh, you know what? Let me go really quick. Some of the school-based effects of the No Child Left Behind. If you look at this, we have some of these things. You have some of this happening, especially elementary schools where I've done a lot of my work. Reduction of social studies, sciences, language arts, reduction of foreign languages, right? Those things are getting pushed out so that we can focus, right? We need to focus on math, we need to focus on literacy, and our numeracy and literacy, because those are the basics, and those will help our students be better students. So that's the theory, and that's been around about in the same time since we've been testing people with this PISA data. So I think it's interesting to look at it and compare. We've had a lot of educational initiatives based on No Child Left Behind, aimed at improving those basic skills. And those are the exact things that are being measured by the PISA. So I want to look at some of the PISA data. This is 2003's PISA data. These are people who are significantly, statistically significantly above the U.S. average. These are those that are the U.S. average. There's no statistical difference. And these are below. These are the OECD countries. These are non-OECD countries. And groups. And since this time, more and more countries are participating in this every year. So the U.S., just taking a look at this, here's our U.S. right here. How does it look like we fared in comparison to? This is just on the mathematics and then the mathematics subscales. So it's not our literacy. How does it look like we're doing? Or we did 10 years ago. All right, so these are 15-year-olds from 10 years ago. So some of these are you guys in this classroom. So thanks a lot. No, I'm just kidding. So 2006 data, if we look at the 2006 data, this is what it says officially, the U.S. report on this, talking about some of the PISA data in terms of how the U.S. is doing, right? So basically saying, again, look, on average, we're scoring below average, or below the mean. 2009 data, it didn't change. We did have scores that were a little bit different, but they weren't statistically different enough from ourselves. And yesterday, as Christine has mentioned here, we have new data, right? Just came out for the 2012 data. It was released yesterday. We get to see what it is, and this is what they said. Can I get someone to read this for me? Go ahead.
Overall, the results show no measurable change in U.S. average scores in mathematics, science, or reading literacy between 2012 and any of the previous U.S. PISA results. U.S. 15-year-old students remain below the OECD average score in mathematics, literacy, and not measurably different from the OECD average in science and reading literacy.
Okay, so in the 12 years we've been doing this, none of these educational initiatives we've seen has really made a dent, right? Now, I'll be upfront with you now. I've told people I've used this data nefariously before to make an argument for things. So I'll be upfront in saying I don't think there's a simple one-pronged solution to this. I don't think there's just one thing we can do that will lead to us doing better. There's lots of things involved. But what I do want to do is I want to talk about one way that I think that can help us and help people in general improve their understanding in some of these basic areas. Christine, you had a question.
I was going to wonder, Poland is the one country that's shown the most movement in the 10 years of the PISA thing. So they were right next to us in 2003, and now they're in the top tier.
And they've shot up. And you do see some other countries with movement. Chile is still below us, but they're moving up in the ranks, and they're moving up especially with their females in the ranks. So there's lots of ways of looking at this data. It's actually really interesting data. As long as the government's not shut down, it's available to you. I did discover, I started to put this together right during the shutdown, the week of the shutdown, and all of the websites I used were shut down. So they've actually added, so initially you had mathematics and literacy with the plan to add science, and they've done that, they've added the science. They've also added in some scores ICT, Internet Communications and Technologies. Information, not internet, sorry. Information, Communications, and Technologies. Unfortunately, if you go through the Data Explorer, this is the result that you get for the U.S. There is no ICT data. Information, Communications, and Technologies represent the technological world that we live in today. Right? We're surrounded by technologies. We use them for most of the jobs that most people do, especially anybody with any sort of formal education is working with technology in some way. And this, over the past two piece of results is what I get when I go and I look for ICT data for the United States. We do start to have ICT data reported for some other countries. Part of this may be because how many people remember taking computer courses as required in elementary and high school?
High school.
High school, what was required for you for high school?
Typing.
Typing, okay, what about you?
We learned basic coding in middle school.
In middle school, was it a required course? All right. So,
I did typing in kindergarten and in junior high. I was
Okay.
required to do keyboarding.
required to do kindergarten, okay? So things, keyboarding in kindergarten. So it's moved down. It was required for me in 9th grade. It's right now currently in the state of Utah required in 7th grade. They've made a proposal to make it required by 3rd grade, right? So that's kind of where Utah is at. And if you want to see where Utah is at specifically, this is, I went and grabbed this off of the website yesterday. So this is where Utah looks at what communications technologies will do, right? These are our standards for these courses, right? Students will be able to create, store, analyze, manipulate, record, and transmit information through 4 major areas. Drafting and design, electronic communication, audiovisual, graphic communications, and they'll be able to tell us the impacts of these things. Alita.
Yeah, in my daughter's elementary school, they do PowerPoint presentations in kindergarten. So they are moving this into the schools younger and younger.
Good. Good. So we're learning PowerPoint from kindergarten. That's great. Michael.
I've actually been really amazed with Utah schools in their computer literacy.
Uh-huh.
Having gone to schools in New York, I was in part of the New York school system, I was part of the Idaho school system. Utah's really got a pretty good, you're shaking your head, but compared to other states, you look at how many high schools have got audiovisual, almost every high school has got there's computers, cameras, graphic design courses, photography courses. That's very uncommon in a lot of other states.
And so Christine's shaking her head saying, no, we're not
There isn't
really
a
there.
single well, there's one high school now, thanks to all my arguing for 4 years, that teaches AP computer science in the entire Utah County. If you go to King County, Washington, there isn't a single high school that doesn't offer AP computer
I
science.
took AP Computer Science at Mountain View High School in 1980
They don't have it anymore.
something, so they eliminated it. Yeah, see, I mean.
And part of the reason is we just don't have it as part of the required standards.
Well, but I
And they don't
mean,
hire for it, because it's very unlikely a computer science teacher coaches football.
well,
All right, so we're being facetious here. All
there
right.
are other options though, because I don't know, like my brother, like the community college, getting credit at community colleges, I don't know, like the AP, like that would be nice to have the AP, but there are a lot of other routes of getting that training.
So there are more and more, and Utah should be, and in my opinion, Utah should be a hub. Utah is often a hub for the genesis of a lot of different technologies. I think Utah should be a hub. It's funny when we look at this, we do look at this, so we do say they are doing something, right? They have some standards up here. They do say every student has to take something. If I go and I look at the curriculum for these courses and some of the folks who teach these, I've talked with them, what's required really is, an 8-week course, and they've got to cover a lot of this, the impacts of communication technologies, right? So they learn a lot about things. If they go on to other classes, they do get to do these things, right? They get to start doing some of the creation. Awesome to hear that kids are putting together presentations in some earlier grades. As far as requirements go, it's not necessarily there. There's an interesting paper out talking about, in the 1980s, right? And talking about when people said, well, computers are going to revolutionize education. They're going to revolutionize this. Look at what people can do. There's so much ability to create. Who was it? You had BASIC, Matt, right? BASIC. In the 1980s, people were teaching BASIC in school and saying this gives students the power and the ability, right? But as Robertson's pointed out up here, you had this dramatic expansion in the 1980s. Basically got taken over by PowerPoint and more flashy type of things that happened in the 90s. And people stopped understanding how the technology worked. And they started understanding that they could do things with technology, but started focusing more on things instead of understanding the conceptual side of things in schools writ large, understanding instead that we could play Math Blaster. We could create flashy presentations instead of understanding what goes into making those things happen. We're making them happen and all that's kind of behind the curtain, right? And the way I describe this, I think what's happened in this world that we're in a technological world, right? We study biology, we study chemistry, we study physics, not because everybody should become a physicist, a biologist, or a chemist, but because that's the world we live in. And understanding those things helps us understand and master the world. Because we understand more about physics now than we did 400 years ago, we can control things. There's much more in our power than there used to be. We still can't control the weather, we still can't do all sorts of things, right? But we're a lot further along than we used to be. Well, would anybody in here argue that technology is not a part of the world that we live in at this point? It's part of this world. So why is it not also something that we should learn so that we can become masters of it? And if we don't become masters of it, we become slaves to it. We don't understand why the storm suddenly hit us. Monday afternoon, it was 60 degrees. It was balmy. It didn't look like winter was ever coming. Tuesday morning, by Tuesday night, we had a foot of snow in our backyard. It's crazy, but you know what? We expected it. We expected it because people have learned enough about the elements that they were able to tell us, you're getting a big storm coming your way, it's going to dump a lot, right? And so we were at least able to prepare for it. Why shouldn't we treat technology the same way? Why should we prepare our students to do more than just keyboarding? Because that's what the majority of you said, I had to do keyboarding. And that's actually what the state standard is for Utah, in addition to being able to tell us about careers. So that's my soapbox. I should get down there. I think it's this idea here that Robinson brings out. These things seem worthwhile, but they don't. He says, while later forms of IT and education which have come to dominate computer use in the same area, such as multimedia encyclopedias and literary books, are worthwhile, their surface sophistication and information richness does not compensate for reduced interactivity levels and the consequent loss of learner engagement and control. What I'd like to argue for is that understanding how the technology works empowers people in whatever realm they're in. We don't want everybody to become programmers, but we do want people to have the ability to program or to direct technology for their own uses in social sciences, in linguistics, in cooking, or whatever it may be. Alita was telling me coming in here that her 18-year-old son has been playing with some robots, and he's discovered these little Arduino chips. They're just small circuit board chips that you can program, and he's looking to reprogram the thermostat in their houses remotely. Is that?
Yeah, I told him he couldn't do that because it would require hooking a computer into the thermostat to change anything.
Yeah, so she didn't want to do that. But he's there. The point is he's got it. Instead of being subject to his thermostat, the thermostat is not subject to him. All right. and his mother, clearly. So the question is, am I just off my rocker, or is anybody doing something about this? The UK had a computing curriculum, a computing core that they recently revamped. So first of all, they have a computing core. That actually says more than what we're at right now. Two, they revamped it. These are their top-level standards or goals for this revamped curriculum. That all pupils can understand and apply the fundamental principles and concepts of computer science. This doesn't necessarily mean that to master technology, that we have to be doing things on the technology. The calculator isn't what does the thinking for you. You tell the calculator what to do, what to think. This is really what they're talking about. They're talking about this idea called computational thinking. Computational thinking is an idea that's being advocated now. It's the way that computer scientists think when they direct computers. People do it, and the argument that people are making is that everybody does it in all sorts of different fields. And they're pointing to these examples of how people are doing it. And what I'm saying is we ought to do it purposefully. We ought to tell people, we ought to give people experiences so that they can think computationally. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, Peter, is there something that's juxtaposed to computational thinking? In other words, if people aren't bringing to bear computational thinking in their problem solving, what kind of thinking are they bringing to bear?
Good question. I'm not sure I've got the full answer to that. I would say some of the things that people do are trial and error. Other things that people do are they say, I have this really good idea, and they're actually thinking computationally, but they lack the computational skills to realize those things, to make them happen. So I do think that people actually do computational thinking in a lot of different areas, but they lack, in addition to the computational thinking, they lack the technical skills to make their ideas happen. Sometimes it happens the other way around. You have people with technical skills who aren't able to create algorithms to solve problems for themselves. They'll say, tell me what to do, and I'll program it, but you've got to come up with the algorithm.
So, would artistic thinking be on the other end of the spectrum, or are they not?
So, I don't know if I can answer that right now, but this is one of the things that we're working on, is trying to identify what this is specifically, and I'll give you a little broader overview. I think dichotomies are useful to help us understand things. We draw distinctions, but they're also dangerous and creating false dichotomies. It's like Republican and Democrat, they're not actually as opposite as they think they are. You disagree with me. So good questions, and these are questions I think that are worth pursuing to figure out what types of thinking are there.
I'm just wondering, because you're making an argument for increasing our abilities to do computational thinking.
Yes.
And if people aren't using computational thinking in their problem solving and in their daily stuff,
What are they doing?
what are they using?
Some of them
And-
aren't actually successful at problem solving, that's what I would say. They're not able to break problems into their constituent components and solve the problems. And that's where they become slaves to someone else's ability to have thought computationally.
So, okay.
Maybe
Does
it's
that make
not,
sense?
maybe it's not a dichotomy, maybe it's just more of a continuum, like,
Yeah.
you know, like you think more it's kind of like literacy, like, you know, it's not that you are something else if you're not literate.
Well,
It's
there's
just
a
you're
certain
lower.
category of problems for which computational thinking is really helpful, and
Lends
there's
itself.
another category of problems for which
That's
maybe
right.
another kind of thinking would be.
I would agree with that, yeah. And like I said at the beginning, you know, I present the data to say, hey, here's a problem, right? I don't think there's a single solution to that problem. I think probably a lot of the problems with education, the problems that people complain about, could actually be solved by non-educational interventions, right? I think parents just sitting with their kids, even if they don't understand what the kids are doing, like me helping my son with Chinese, I have no idea what I'm doing or what he's doing. I was like, is that what it says? Okay, no, do it again. I know that you're faking it, right? So, but just doing that increases his ability to perform in that area. That's not really an educational intervention, right? We can solve a lot of our problems, but that's another soapbox. There was I think, was it John or, no, go
I
ahead.
was just gonna say, maybe we can look back historically and say, what were my parents and some of my generation who were not exposed to computers per se, what are their thinking patterns and what did they use in answer to Dr. Graham's question? What are their patterns, even today, that especially those who have not adopted or immersed themselves in the use of computers? We could probably find trends or patterns to answer that question.
We probably could. I'm not sure that's necessarily the path I would go down in terms of utility of value. I would say I look at my dad and what he was doing. I think, again, people have been thinking computationally for, I'd say, centuries or eons, right? Computational thinking, if we were to break it down, so this is, let me show you this way. This is something Tyler's been working with me on. We've looked at a lot of people who say, this is computational thinking, and they're largely computer scientists. And they say, this is computational thinking, and they show us all these different things. And what we're trying to do is come up with some sort of organizing structure for understanding it. And what we've come up with so far are sort of three broad categories to say, these things, most things that people say fit into these three areas, more or less. But it's the ability to create abstractions, models, algorithms, functions, right? To take something and create an abstraction for it. But then it's the ability to also automate that thing, right? Can we take that, can we automate it so that it can run on its own? And then its ability, oh, I wrote apply, that's not right. Analyze. It should say analyze, I apologize. It's the ability to analyze something, right? How can I take those results and look at them and understand them and go through this process? And this may not be a step through process this way. Not everything that we do in this way is even done, again, with computers. Let me give you an example. I didn't bring it in here. I should have had that as another example. But serialization and parallelization, right? These are two we put them under automation, right? When something is run in parallel, what does that mean?
At the same time.
What's that?
Run at the same time.
Run at the same time, okay? And when something is run in serial, what does that mean?
One after the other.
One after the other. Kids learn about this in creating batteries in science class. I don't know, do you guys ever do, it's your space center, right? But if you ever do like a potato, has anybody here ever made a battery out of potatoes? Right? And those potato batteries, well, you find out that a potato has enough juice to power some small electronics. But it doesn't even have 1.5 volts. It's got about, depending on the size of the potato, it's usually got about 1/2 of a volt, right? We need 1.5 volts. So what you do is you connect the potatoes serially together, and connecting them together, that more or less adds up their voltage. So I can get 1.5 volts by serially connecting my potatoes, right? But the problem is that that doesn't last very long. The charge gets sucked out really quickly. So it's interesting that if you connect potatoes in parallel, you can extend, it doesn't increase the voltage, but it does extend the charge, how long that charge will last. Well, these are computational ways of thinking computationally that you don't need a computer to do, right? People have been doing them without a computer, but computers, we use them for largely in computers as well. We do a lot of things with computers. So again, I don't think this is an ability that's specific to computers. It's our ability to think computationally. I don't know if that answers, somebody had a question. That answers the question I was asking. All right, so if we look at this, if I break it down to fundamentals even, those are processes, right? But if I break it down to concepts, students have trouble understanding some very basic concepts that we try and advocate for in classes. Variables, functions, application of math to real problems. So I thought, let's do a little bit of math. All right, so what do I have up here?
Grossness.
Grossness, okay, that's the response of a lot of students, grossness, okay? I have a function, okay? This is the function, this is function notation in algebra, right? So I've got g of x equals 5x divided by 2. So if g is 6, what is the result? If I've got g of 6, I change x to 6, what is my output?
15.
15, okay? So that's g of 6 equals 5 times 6 divided by 2, okay? What is this?
A little more complicated.
A little more complicated, but not much, right? But students see this and they say grossness. Michael's shaking his head over there.
Yep, nope.
Why would I ever use this, right? Now what if I say, okay, well, evaluate f of g of x? Then that's what did you just, who said that? That's where I check out? All right, Michael says that's where I check out. And unfortunately this happens with a lot of students, right? I was one of those students in school who had all the right situations to succeed at this. My dad was a nuclear physicist, right? So I got a rocket scientist for a dad. I can make jokes about it. I was the 5th of 10 kids. All my brothers and sisters succeeded in math ahead of me going through this. I was one of those students who did this, but I didn't understand it, right? I was able to pass these questions off, but I knew when I was doing it that I didn't really understand functions. And I didn't really understand them until I started programming. When I started programming, all of a sudden I said, man, I get it. I wish I could go back and do those things again. Because now I understand what I'm doing. Now I understand why I'm doing it, right? And so you have some people who say, you know what, we need a more project-based approach to things. Now I'm actually of the opinion that we need to understand things in the abstract as well. I think there's a dangerous paradigm, we go through paradigm and pendulum swings in education. I think there's a dangerous myth right now that project-based is better. And then we go through another way, that being able to think about things abstractly is better. I think it's both of those things mixed together. And let me give you an example, a little bit. I'm going to skip through a slide here really quickly, actually. If it'll skip through it, it's not skipping. All right. I'll get my slides going. Oh, that's what I wanted, slides. And now I'll go. That happened a little bit with me in looking at languages, right? So I before my mission, I learned a little bit of Spanish. That was my undergraduate degree, was in Spanish. I served a mission in Brazil. I came back from my mission, and I had a 321 Spanish class. 2 hours later, I had a 321 Portuguese class. By the books, I was at the same level in these courses. But my knowledge of these two languages was wildly different, right? They're very related languages, but I had a very applied and colloquial understanding of Portuguese and a very academic understanding of Spanish. As throughout the years, you know, my wife is Hispanic. Throughout the years, I've had the opportunity to go to church in Spanish for several years. One of the things that I found is there are people in church who speak Spanish well and people who don't. Gringos who do and gringos who don't, right? And there's varying levels along those as well. And I find that somebody who's lived in the country tends to speak better than somebody who's just studied it, right? So that project-based, I can see where people would say that applied understanding certainly outweighs this. But I found that the people who speak it the best are the people who studied it and lived in the country. Those are the people who are able to deal with it better. And I think what's happening, if you look at foreign languages, there was this idea, this doctrine of discipline back in the day, that studying the classics, Greek, this was the old back to the basics. It actually used to be different only 130 years ago or so, right? It was if you studied the classics, Greek, Latin, and geometry. This was before we actually had algebra, right? So those were the things that increased your mental acuity. Well, people said, there's actually not much to that. We have somebody who you couldn't, as Andy's mentioned before, you couldn't be in education without citing. You had Thorndike come along and say, this is phooey, right? None of this is true because let me show you. People who study these things aren't smarter people all around, right? The problem is people throw the baby out with the bathwater. And in doing that, they say, well, there's nothing to that at all. Well, the problem is, usually when somebody notices something, there's something to it. But we may have misattributed it initially, or over-attributed it, which happens more often than not. And so what happened with the doctrine of discipline is people said, Thorndike was right. The more similar that tasks are to each other, the more likely you are to have transfer among a task. Well, if you go and look at this, in the 1960s and 70s, there was a push again to have people start studying Latin all across the country. And we're not talking about Latin all day long, Latin immersion. We're talking about 15, 30, sometimes an hour of Latin a day in elementary schools. Students of Latin consistently outperformed their non-Latin studying peers in English tests, their native language, right? Even though actually the purpose of Latin was to help them more with their English, right? So 30 minutes of school a day, you've got it all across the country this is happening. You've got well-recognized, standardized tests, the gold standard happening on these. It happens with sister languages as well. Your dad's done some work on this, actually, looking at cross-linguistic influence, right? Languages that are related to each other. People who have a second language tend to do better in their first language than those who don't have that second language.
I don't believe that one.
So, it's even true of those not studying sister languages, related languages, right? It's been found time and time again, right? I think the same thing happened to me with programming and the mathematical thinking. Computational thinking is a way to help people. It fits within this framework of what I call convergent cognition. It fits within a framework to help people say, you know what, instead of just narrowing down to the basics, the problem with the math right now is I think we do need to study it. We need to understand that it is an abstraction of the world we live in. But a lot of students will say, when am I ever going to use this? And Courtney's not in here today. For those of you, how many people know Courtney? All right, she's one of our students in here. Courtney used to be a middle school math teacher. And occasionally she had students ask, when am I ever going to use this? And occasionally she had to give the answer next week on the test. That's got to be the most demotivating answer I can receive as a student. A lot of students don't see the purpose in it. Well, this goes back to Moses and Cobb's claim that what we need is we need a way for people to apply the knowledge that they're getting in the abstract as well. And I think that that is not by narrowing things down just to the basics. I think what that means is combining those things with complementary subjects or complementary ways of thinking that will help them apply those things and get some overlap in their thinking. So I'm focusing right now on the mathematical side of things and the computational thinking side, right? I think it happens, as Charles has asked at the beginning, could music be added to my list? I think it could. But we still have the problem of, who cares? When am I ever going to use this? So how many people here have ever played a game to learn something? We've got some hands going up. People are ashamedly raising their hands. All right. How would you say learning games compare to just not non-learning games, just entertainment games?
They're far less entertaining.
They're far less entertaining. Okay, a lot of people are like, not cool. Learning games are just lame. In fact, you could take a game that's fun and just tell somebody it's a learning game and then it's no fun. Right? So games are one way that people are trying to make learning more interesting, trying to help people see the applications for it. But we've got Jasmine Kafai, a student of Seymour Pepper at MIT, who she said, you know, well, what we're looking at is the playing of games to help people learn these applications of things. But far few people have looked at the design of the games. And learning through design is a great way to learn. So this is the approach that I'm taking. So to answer your question, what do robots and games and second language and math have to do with each other? Let's make a game right now really quickly, right? So how many people here played Mario? Mario Brothers. All right, Mario Brothers. That's what's called the side scroller, right? You've got the background scrolling the background. It's a two-dimensional game, and Mario looks like he's running through the screen. He's really in the same spot most of the time on the screen. But let's go ahead and create a biker bash as a game right now. So I've got a biker here, and if I want to move the biker across the screen, what am I going to need? I'm going to need coordinates, axes, right? So I've got this right here. Already now I have a reason for students to learn coordinate geometry, right? Now these coordinates actually are a little bit different, or they're a little bit different than what people are dealing with, right? But I think that's okay, and we'll see why in a minute. So I need an X and a Y. So if I want to move this guy, let's say every time I press the right arrow, he's going to go 2 spaces across the screen. So he starts out at an X of 0 and a Y of 14, let's say. Actually, this looks more like the other way around. But, and now I move him 2 spaces. I move him 2 spaces. I have to tell the computer, move him 2 spaces. So now I have a reason for using very simple mathematics. As he's moving across the screen. But that's not a very fun game because the guy moving across the screen isn't very engaging. Let's put some obstacles on the screen, right? And as he does things, let's give him a score. So a score is an immediate way to help students understand the concept of variable, which ends up is difficult for students to get. Right? So let's say if I jump over this, woohoo, I get 10 points. All right, look at that, I got 10 points. Okay, so now I'm making this game, I now have use for variables and coordinate systems. But that's still not that fun of a game because nothing's being thrown at me. And that makes things fun for some reason. All right? So let's throw something at this guy. Don't do it! No, what's going to happen? Oh. Okay, what happened?
Minus
Paintball
points.
got
My paintball.
So I heard a couple of things. Say that again?
Paintball. Minus points.
Oh, minus points. Oh, I should take points away. I need to change my variable again. Minus points. But in order to do that, in order to tell it how to splat, the students now have an answer to their question that they asked their math teacher. When am I ever going to use the Pythagorean theorem? How many people here have found that they actually use the Pythagorean theorem? Right? Good. We've got about half the people. It's actually a really useful theorem. I went to Mexico and I taught adult literacy. And I was there teaching adult literacy. I had one of the adults ask me some questions about, how do I make my house square? All of a sudden I had a use for some of these things that I never understood why I would need them before, right? They end up being very useful, and if you understand how to use them, you're enabled. And so I think that's what I'm saying there. It's not necessarily that I either think this way or that way. It enables you to think a certain way. And so if I look at this, we have students actually calculating the distance between this so they can figure out when the distance is 0, or getting close. Maybe we want to make the background turn yellow or something. And so in a very simple game, students have used several different concepts now that they may have previously struggled with. I still think they need the instruction that they're getting the other way. But by building a game, it gives them a way to think computationally. So just really quickly, I want to talk about some of the research that I've done with this. Bootstrap is one I reported on here before. We found somebody who was actually already having kids build games, and actually side-scroller games like this. Actually, it wasn't a side-scroller, but it was a very similar game to this. And using a functional programming language. I'm going to show you really quickly. The purpose of this was to determine if and to what extent students' understanding of variable and function improved as a result of learning to program. And so we did a couple of different schools. And what I want to show you here, can you guys, oops, can you hear that?
This is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. C squared is the distance between the two vectors. So that's c squared because that's like I have it all programmed in. That's a bunch of conditionals. So I have these just like normal, and I have WASD, which shows the little star, and IJKL, which makes it move farther.
Okay, he learned a lot. He was on this at home, trying to work on different things, and coming home every day saying, "Oh, I know how to do this. I can't wait to do this."
Was being able to have it at home a big help?
Yes, very big help.
What's more fun, math or computer programming?
Computer program.
Why is that?
Just you get to play. Yeah. So we made this and we get to play with it and stuff. Test out everything. And in math, all you do is write the equation. This, you do the same thing, but then you bring your equation to life. So that's why it's funner.
So I think he, as he explained it there, you do the same thing. They're recognizing that they are doing the same thing, but they bring their equation to life. I think it's still important for them to have both, but it's actually by having both that they improve what they're doing. It's kind of like, I think I skipped over it earlier. Let me see if I can find my slide here. It's kind of like this. This is how I explain. Helps me understand it a little bit. What shape do you see there?
Square.
A square. Okay. Let's suppose that square is a function. It represents the idea of a function. Okay. What shape do you see there? A square. I'm not trying to trick you. It's the exact same square. I just copied it and made it a different color. Okay. So it's a square, right? Well, let's suppose that square also represents a function, but it represents a function from JavaScript, let's say. Right, so this is a JavaScript representation of a function. There are actual qualitative differences between these functions, and once you start working with them, you realize these differences. Some people are afraid that by introducing more subjects, more topics to kids to learn, that we take away from their time to learn something, and therefore we harm them. Right? The studies that are done in second language acquisition have found repeatedly that introducing a second language into the school does not decrease students' performance in other areas. We tend to think that, oh, it's either one or the other. It's all cumulative, right? It's not all cumulative. The way that people learn isn't all cumulative. Well, so what do I have here? I have two functions or two what? Squares. What if I can see the two squares at the same time? What shape do I have now? What do I see? What's that? A cube, right? Maybe I need to draw those lines in for you, maybe I don't. Maybe what I realize is that, you know what, these are two sides of the same idea. These are two shapes. And because they're different, and because they're the same, I can understand the ways in which a function might differ. I can understand the ways in which a function might be. What are the fundamental aspects of a function? I can understand how to abstract it in different situations. I think it's very important for us to help people understand these concepts relate in a lot of different ways in a lot of different areas. And so, if we look at this, some of the research we've done, we found that over just 9 courses, students increased their understanding of variable. I don't actually think it's a quick shot. I think what we really need to do is see what happens over a long time. And so if I were to go, there's one study that we did where we talked to professional programmers. And we asked them, we got them from a lot of different backgrounds. People who hated math, people who love math, people who did great in programming, people who got kicked out of PE. Actually, students, I had one of these programmers in middle school had gotten ejected from PE for the year. And a teacher gave him a programming book, and he sat in the office and wrote a programming book, and eventually, right? We asked them about their understanding and how it affected their understanding of mathematics. Basically, they told us in these 4 areas, this is the thing it helped them do. It helped them provide a context for a lot of these abstracts. It helped them break down the barriers, right? So it didn't necessarily help them think that they were doing math. A lot of them actually refused to acknowledge that they were doing math, even though the math that some of these people were employing was actually pretty advanced. So I think there's a misconception of what it means to do mathematics, right? But some of these programmers said it broke down the barriers where I would go to a professor or a teacher in another grade, and I would ask them, look, I want to build a clock, and I want the clock to do this, and I know that there's a formula that will help me represent it in this way. Can you tell me what that is, right? Another one who felt like he was actually cheating the math. Actually, several of them talked about cheating the math by programming it out, by creating an abstraction. They were able to, one of them talked about in a calculus course in college, he was able to use his programming skills to approximate an answer much more than he could doing the calculus by hand. He realized that, hey, I can just create a formula, and I can tell that formula to repeat itself 1,000,000 times or X number of times until I get to a very specific answer that I couldn't get if I couldn't have created that abstraction and automated it, and then I can analyze those results. So this is one of the things I mentioned. Courtney, another area in which we're doing some research, Courtney's working on right now is she's creating an instructional unit where kids are learning to program, and the purpose is to help them learn to program. But in the learning to program, they're aligning it with the 8th grade core, some of the concepts in there, so that they actually have a way of applying some of those concepts. Again, I don't think that we need to get rid of these core subjects or these basics. But what I think is that by learning to think computationally, what we can do is we help students, we enable students. We give them a way to master the world that they live in today. We give people a way to say, well, this is what's happening right now. If I were to go to a website, right here, oh, you can't even see it right there. Okay. If I were to go to this website, go to my email or whatever it is, and it's this direction. Even something as simple as understanding how URLs work. This gets at the very same idea of variables and functions, right? Understanding that gobbledygook that's up there in the URL, that a lot of it is just variables, and that I can manipulate that to my means. I had a conference a couple of years back where I regularly will do a workshop, and the conference organizer told me, if you don't have 10 people sign up, I won't waive the conference fee for you. And he said, here's a link to those that are signed up for your course, your workshop. So I went to the link. There were a grand total of 3 people signed up. And they had a week left before they were going to shut down the workshop sign-ups and tell me that I had to pay for conference instead of getting it free because of doing a workshop. I said, oh no, that's not very good. But I wonder how all the other workshops are faring, right? Well, it just so happened at the top the URL said where W equals 11. I said, well, that probably means workshop, right? And Y equals 2011 or whatever year it was. That probably equals workshop. So I can see what the other people, and you can look at that as nefarious or not. So I looked at every other workshop because I understood the technology, I understood the fundamental concepts that were underlying it. And I'm not saying I'm a master of this yet. I'm far from it. And I don't know, the masters of people are the people who are going to become the programmers, just like the master biologists and the master chemists and the master. But we ought to understand enough that we can think in such a way that we are not subject to the technology. By the way, I found out everybody had about 2 people signed up. Within a week, it filled up. So it was all good. If I understand this, I can understand maybe when I download a file and it doesn't load on my computer, I can understand, oh, the extension got gobbledygook up, right? Let me change the extension. Let me understand. Again, if I go back to this, the ability to think computationally is an ability that exists outside of computers. we have personified it with computers. But it's something that we ought to be doing. Right now, what we're doing is we're moving keyboarding to an earlier age. That's playing catch-up. It's not even a very good catch-up. It's a really weak attempt. It's like sprinting for 5 yards in a 5K when you realize you're behind everybody by a couple minutes, right? In my opinion. I think what the UK is doing, the UK, consequently, they score about where we do on most of their PISA results. So they're not doing fantastically better. But what they've said is, you know what? We're going to start doing this. This is the world we live in, and instead of playing catch-up, we want to say, where do we want our students to be by the time they graduate? Where do we want to position ourselves? So, anyhow, I guess, like I said, I've been up on my soapbox today. This is what I do. If anybody's interested in thinking about things computationally, this is why I create games, not because games necessarily are the fun thing to do, which they are, but because we learn a lot, and it gives a lot of opportunity for me to think computationally. It gives me the opportunity to create functions. It gives me the opportunity to automate things, to create models. I wish my skills were better, right? There's a lot of things that I'll go and ask people. I'll say, how do I do this, right? How do I randomize this? How do I create this? I can understand how to do them. But if we were to have a curriculum where K-8, K-12, we had students starting to think this way, I think we would have a much different world than where we're headed for right now. So if anybody's interested, I was going to show you a robot. This is actually the task. I teach a robotics after school workshop, and I've got Tyler and some other people teaching them. Today's task that I was going to have my students do, I was going to show you this and show you how in doing the robot, they're understanding, again, the same idea of variables. I think we need to come at it from all sides of that box. I think the one approach to understanding the one side of the box, we're always just going to see a square.